Thanks for having me today at this Mobility Summit. I work in the Advanced Transport team at NEF, and I thought I'd spend some time talking to you about the electric vehicle revolution. So to start off, I'm going to look at the industry today. And what we see is that even in a pandemic, we've seen a rise in electric vehicle sales. And now we're at around 2.5 million sales this year, which should leave us at around 5 million EV sales at the end of the year, up from around 2 million in 2019. So that just gives you a good idea of how quickly this industry is moving. And China is probably going to take back its crown this year from Europe on having the most EV sales. It might surprise you to know that last year, actually, Europe was the biggest EV market in the world. North America, you can see quite a small portion of sales in comparison. But after Biden has announced his infrastructure deal and some of the changes in fuel economy targets there, we expect that North America is going to catch up with Europe and China as well over time in share of sales. Now, of these sales, not every single one is the same, and we count those from battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid vehicles. And around the world today, we see around 68% of those sales are from battery electric vehicles, and just 32% are from plug-in hybrids. But that does change depending on the market and the incentives that are provided by the governments. So in Germany, for example, you get more incentives for plug-in hybrids, and therefore the percentage of PHEVs is higher, getting closer to 50% of PHEVs and BEVs in the market, for example. Now, in our team, we do a forecast. You might see some of this publicly available each year, and we're in the 6th edition. Now, it's titled the Electric Vehicle Outlook, but actually it could be called the Transport Outlook. And this looks at how many kilometers of travel we see globally, how we see shared autonomous vehicles, micromobility interacting on a global stage, and then what do we see happening in the electric vehicle market. And from there, we look at the impacts. So what happens with battery metals, what happens with oil demand, electricity demand. Now, I haven't got time today to talk to you about all of them, but I'm going to talk about the vehicle sales, and I'm also going to talk about charging infrastructure and electricity demand. So in the forecast, we look across these 4 categories. So on the left-hand side, you've got 2- and 3-wheelers. Then we've got buses, cars and vans, and trucks. Now, whilst the picture looks very rosy in the number of sales that we've seen so far, to put some realism on that, in 2020, we saw around 40% EV share of sales for buses and 2- and 3-wheelers. This largely driven by countries abroad, so China, Southeast Asia, India, very high up on the 2- and 3-wheelers. China specifically big on the buses, for example. But global share of sales much lower when we start to think about vans and passenger vehicles. Now, we've heard good stories. If we think about Europe, certainly Norway over 50-60% EV share of sales. A lot of the big markets like Germany now reaching 15% share of sales. But globally last year, just 4% share of sales for EVs. So still quite some way to go. And the last categories of trucks really quite sobering, 0% share of sales if we round that to the right number. And by 2040, whilst you might think that would hit 100%, if you look at some of the economics and hard to electrify areas, we still see there's some way to go, whether that be 2- and 3-wheelers, buses, or those vans and cars, and certainly a long way to go for the trucks. Now, we're hearing a lot more in the news about truck manufacturers going electric, about the infrastructure becoming available, and the battery technology becoming bigger. So whilst this 29% is maybe slightly pessimistic, there is still some way to go, and politicians are certainly looking at this further. Now, the gap to remain, it becomes difficult to assess. So what we've done this year is look at net zero targets. So the idea is by 2050, in a net zero scenario, all vehicles in the fleet would be electric across each category. And you can see on these charts by the dotted line how that happens versus the solid line for each category of where we are in our forecast. Now, I already told you that trucks were lower, so unsurprisingly, by 2050, we see a big gap in that area. And now for vans and trucks, they may account for something like 16% of vehicles on the road, but they actually account for closer to 50% of total emissions. So governments are certainly looking at this in more detail. So that means more fuel economy standards expected to come in, as well as that more money for charging infrastructure, particularly in depots and on highways, to facilitate these vehicles travelling further on their battery ranges. But we also need lots of different types of charging infrastructure. So I don't actually work for NLX, and I know this slide might seem like an advertisement for the company, but it was the best one I could find that showed a range of charging infrastructure that is available, and to highlight the point that we actually need all of this different type of infrastructure in all the different locations. So today, homes dominate when we think about the total charging infrastructure that will be installed. And somewhere around 60 to 80% of BEV drivers have a home charger in Europe and the US, to the best of our knowledge today. But public charging is becoming more important, and so is faster versions of this. So on the right, you can see a fast charger. And within the last sort of 3 years, they've moved from 50 kilowatt to 350 kilowatt. And we're starting to see more companies announce higher speed charging vehicles. And XPeng announced the other day a concept with over 400 kilowatt of charging. So this is becoming more important, and it lowers charging speeds for people. Along with the charging technology, clearly battery technology is also important in facilitating this change. So then we've got the public charging space, and as I said, public charging is not used so much today in Europe and the US, but it is in China because they've got more apartment buildings. And you can see here China accounting for over 60% of all the public chargers installed globally. Last year they installed over 300,000 chargers, and in December alone they installed 100,000. And that's in comparison to 100,000 last year in Europe and around 10,000 in the US. So the scale of the Chinese industry is much bigger. But there is good news in Europe and the US. Certainly those markets starting to move as we see more EV sales and more funding kind of coming in, whether that be from SPACs and IPOs of some of these charging companies, or from them gaining more finance to deliver on their plans and promises to roll out this infrastructure. Now, when we go from the charging infrastructure today to predict what we need in future, we look at electricity demand. So this chart here is showing you in a net zero scenario how much electricity demand is needed, and it's around 8,000 terawatt hours by 2050, and you can see how quickly that scales. What is important is also to think about which vehicles cause that demand. And the red here is just highlighting for vans and trucks. They're almost 50% of the electricity demand, and therefore they will need these specific high power chargers at depots and in public locations along highways in Europe and the US and around the world. We also see this category, which is one worth thinking about. So the dashed line is robo-taxis and autonomous vehicles. We don't know exactly when they're going to come in, but certainly will be important when they do. And we see it getting bigger from 2030, accounting for somewhere close to 15 to 20% of electricity demand by 2050. And that means that you want to charge without a plug. And here you see a wireless charger. Could also be a robotic charger, and there's many different concepts of this that are around. This one is kind of a VW robot that can drive, but certainly you'll have a different type of technology, and that needs to be considered in the investments that might be made in the late 2020s, because you don't want to have redundant infrastructure across the world. Now, all of this electricity demand, we think, is around 15 to 20% of global demand by 2050, so it's a huge amount. Now, it's difficult to get that figure exact because we've got other moving pieces. The electrification of heating, for example, is another one. And what this poses here for transport is both challenges and opportunities. So some of the challenges is, do we have enough electricians? Can we get the grid upgrades quickly enough? Can we do the planning to make sure we can have all of this charging infrastructure when it's needed? But there's also opportunities. So the opportunities is the flexibility of this demand is going to be greater than any of the flexibility that exists within the network globally. And we're starting to see how that plays out with home charging today. You can start and stop that on demand. And what that means really is that you can use all of that storage in those batteries to help the grid and also help emissions. But the reason I show the Ford F-150 is because this has bidirectional capability. You can suck the energy out of the pack and use it to power your home or to power the grid. And that is important because it can be used to suck up currently curtailed energy in the grid. And it can also be used to lower the emissions intensity of the grid, therefore. So politicians are really looking at this in more detail. And I think we could see even mandates in future, from my opinion. And if you look at the legislation from the European government today, what they're starting to say is we want DNOs and grid operators to discuss with automakers and charging companies of how you can implement bidirectional technology. Now, whether or not we have smart or bidirectional chargers, we have a forecast. And you can see some of the types of chargers that we have and the locations that we forecast them in globally. It's around 310 million in our base case by 2040, quite dominated by 250 million home chargers, with around 24 million public chargers and just 4 million for e-buses and trucks. And that rises over time, depending on both scenarios. So ETS to 2050, around 450 million, rising to 700 million in the net zero, requiring somewhere around $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion in investment. And that would rise if that included more of these grid upgrades that you see. Now, in that forecast, you might have noticed home dominated around 87% of all the chargers, whereas the DC chargers just 2% of the total. And whilst that 2% looks really small, it actually hides the importance. So for buses and trucks, it's quite easy to understand how they can account for 25% of total demand. They drive a long way, they're quite heavy, whereas not so easy for passenger vehicles. So where that 2% of chargers accounts for 50% of demand, I'll just kind of talk about that for a second. So for a passenger vehicle, we see that serving the demand for between 1 and 5 vehicles annually. For a home charger, maybe you're serving your car, maybe it's 2 cars in a household. For a public charger that's slow, we don't see that increasing vastly. We kind of see that you end up with a reasonable amount of blocking of those chargers. Perhaps they're outside an apartment building and they get used by a vehicle every evening, but they don't get used in the day. Whereas for some of these ultra-fast chargers, not only are they 50 times more powerful, but also they can be utilized more heavily than we expect so. So somebody's driving up and using it for 20 minutes. And what this does, if you think about the number of EVs and the number of chargers, is one, it drives down the home charger percentage over time. We see less people installing a home charger, and we see more shared home chargers as more people with 2 vehicles adopt them. But in the middle, this kind of increase in utilization and increase in power drives up the number of EVs per public connector from what we see between 5 and 20 today to between 30 and 40 in future. And you can see that in the middle chart. Now, it's a contentious industry, so I'll just highlight that we're not sure of all of these things and all of the interactions between the power, the location of charging, and the utilization. And there's a lot of technological change going on. So clients can use our model and go in there and look at the sensitivities of what's happening. And we also track data sets on the current rollout of charging infrastructure. So whilst I've given a vision and where we think this might go, we're by no means sure, and this is changing quite quickly. So I'd just like to thank you for your time today, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.